Well, Northern Ireland has been without a functioning executive for nearly 1,000 days, coming up for 3 years, and a new report suggests it's led to the stalling of reforms, an accountability gap and a lack of representation in the Brexit process. Well, with me is Rutter, who's the Programme Director at the Institute for Government and co-author of Governing Without Ministers, which is published today. But, I mean, Rutter, you can't really say Northern Ireland hasn't had much influence when the DUP have been calling the shots for the government on occasion.
I think the DUP clearly have had influence. What we haven't seen is that's obviously a very unbalanced influence, and I think one of the things that we see in representation, partly due to the sort of abstentionist policy of Sinn Féin, is that we only hear one side of the community voice in Northern Ireland. People who go to Northern Ireland and hear what Manufacturing Northern Ireland is saying, what the Ulster Farmers Union is saying, hear very different things from some of the things that we see on the floor of the House when all we see is the DUP. I think what's very interesting is if the executive were functioning, then the First Minister and Deputy First Minister, DUP, Sinn Féin together, would have to be formulating a view that worked for the two communities in Northern Ireland, for all the people of Northern Ireland.
They don't want to do that, do they?
They don't want to do that, and that is one of the big problems with not having had the executive, and the fact that there's been this great governance gap in Northern Ireland for, as you said, nearly 1,000 days.
What are the chances of getting MPs back, members of the Assembly back to work in Stormont?
They're probably not great at the moment because, as you say, the DUP have a different route to influence. And I think one of the things we're saying is that Westminster parties need to think about their relationship with Northern Ireland parties, given the role of the Westminster government as a guarantor of the Good Friday Agreement. They need to be able to act as a clear, honest broker between the parties, and that's quite difficult when they have a confidence supply agreement with one of the parties. But more generally, we think this needs to be, the profile needs to be raised. That's why it's great that Sky is covering this.
We've done quite a lot on the border.
There's a lot on the border, but actually there are a whole lot of other decisions that aren't being made because there's no government in Northern Ireland. As you said, public services going unreformed. There's a backlog of decisions. There was an inquiry a couple of years ago about compensating the victims of historical abuse. Everybody in Northern Ireland agrees there should be compensation, but those victims are still waiting for their compensation because there's no government in Northern Ireland and the Westminster government hasn't moved to compensate.
And there's this controversy over making abortion laws the same in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, well, that's an area where Westminster, not the government, but MPs have acted, tacking it on to the piece of legislation that the government needed to introduce to extend the period that they could allow going forward without an election in Northern Ireland. And that actually points to another problem. At the moment, Westminster can legislate for Northern Ireland, but it has to take primary legislation. What do we know at the moment? Because the government hasn't got a majority, because it's risking any legislation it does bring forward being hijacked for other purposes. There are lots of things where there should be legislation about Northern Ireland, but there's agreement in Northern Ireland that things need to be addressed, not abortion, but the Westminster government's very reluctant to act on those.
The government is saying that it wants the Assembly to have, as it were, a veto on any arrangements to do with the Northern Ireland backstop. Is that, within the context of Brexit, a sensible suggestion?
I think it's quite interesting to see how this would work. So you could say, one of the things that we show in our report is actually how fragile the executive has been. There's been a sort of history of periods of the executive working and then a bit of collapse, if the executive goes away. So one of the things we try to address is actually, could you set it up so it can govern Northern Ireland more effectively when it comes back? And it's a really interesting question about giving such a divisive issue to both the executive and the Assembly, because if you say to Northern Ireland, do we stay close to the Republic and the EU, or do we go with GB and the United Kingdom? That's exactly the sort of issue which is at the source of the big division between the communities and the major parties in Northern Ireland. So I think that's quite a difficult ask. I think there is a possibility that you could construct a sort of Stormont lock, which had a presumption that Northern Ireland would stay aligned with the EU, but require arrangements which it would have to vote decisively not to stay aligned with the EU, and then basically use the fact that it's very difficult to get decisions to happen as a way of saying to the EU, well, you're taking a bit of a risk that Northern Ireland will go with the UK, but actually in practice it isn't going to happen. I'm not sure I see that as a very reliable way through, and I'm not sure it'd be acceptable to the EU as a way through, because what they're looking for and what they think they've banked in the backstop are hard guarantees. They would be taking a gamble on that.
OK, well, Jill Rutter of the Institute for Government, thank you very much indeed. That report on governance in Northern Ireland out today.